teachers, what was the worst thing a substitute teacher did while you were gone? I was a teacher's assistant while in college. The teacher and I took a week-long workshop and had a sub. The worst thing she did? Not letting the kids go to the bathroom. It was in kindergarten, and she said all the kids going to the bathroom was interrupting the class. One girl wet herself. School policy was if kids under a certain age had an accident, the nurse would give them a pull-up, basically a diaper to wear. The substitute proceeded to make fun of the girl for wearing a diaper, calling her a baby and such. The little girl ended up facing repercussions at home, too. It was devastating to hear about. Did this person get into teaching to torment children? Is that it? That's the only reasonable explanation I can think of for acting like this to a child. That's just horrible. Story 2. I came back after being gone 1 day, and my students told me the substitute teacher flipped over tables in a rage and was escorted from the building by a cop. What actually happened is that the sub left the room to take a 20-minute phone call, and the kids thought it would be funny to flip the tables over. The substitute then had to flip the tables right side up while yelling at the kids. Then, during lunch, my special ed co-ed teacher came into my room to set up and caught the sub making out with a student. Turns out she was 18 to his 25, and the 20-minute phone call was to set up the lunch meeting. The principal then had them escorted from the building by the resource officer. This is why I say having a sub is more work than just coming into school my damn self. Story 3. Accused a student of stealing something that the aide had put away. This was a class that contained some pretty rough students, including one suspended multiple times for fighting and some gang members. She decided to go after a sweet petite girl that never caused trouble and was generally popular with her classmates. This set off the entire class, which is when the sub went ballistic and started wildly throwing accusations and yelling at said students. Security eventually got called and took several students out. My first clue was when the sub got my cell number from the staff directory and went off for 20+ minutes about how bad my students had been. This was followed up with an extremely long email and a 2-page written note on my desk, plus a concerned note from the administrator about not having appropriate sub plans. She didn't follow them in the first place and decided to throw me under the bus. The next morning when I arrived at school, the students were waiting for me at the door. Once I got them calmed down enough to tell their side of the story, we had a discussion on how they could have handled the situation differently. I promised them to never get that sub again. On a related note, I had a good relationship with said rough children because I treated them with respect and fairness. They usually behaved for me. Story 4. Lost more than half of my textbooks that I purchased myself, as well as textbooks that were school property. Administration just shrugged at this, until they found out the textbooks belonging to the school were around $120 each. Also lost all of the book assignments of 4 classes I asked him to collect so I could correct those at home. Kinda sucked for the students who put a lot of work into it and didn't have digital copies. Also didn't teach anything that I asked him to because he didn't really like the subject matter. Also didn't bother grading. When I checked the grades he had given out, there was only 1 grade and everyone else was given 8 out of 10. Even students that didn't take my class. Story 5. Not a teacher, but the sub made the handicapped classmate who has muscle, joint, and vision complications go grab his textbook from his home room. He's not completely helpless, but when it comes to heavy things, he needs help. Classmate's homeroom was halfway across campus, and the required book consists of 5 large text volumes because they're specifically made for his poor vision. He can't wear glasses either due to complications. I offered to help because I'm usually the one that goes and grabs it for him during normal class, but the sub yelled at me, saying he knows my kind and I'm just trying to get out of class. Sub told me he's not there to play games and for me to quit it before he sends me off to the principal's office. Needless to say, the entire class was shocked. Classmate came back with another student from homeroom requesting that next time, the sub send someone else to grab the books because my classmate can't carry it himself. When my usual teacher came back, we requested the sub not to return because of what he said to us and did to classmate. My teacher wrote an email to the principal about it, and that was that. The sub was so desperate for the command of the classroom they thought they deserved that they just were an absolute jerk. I feel like with all these disabilities and complications, it would be pretty obvious visually though, no? Maybe it wasn't, in which case the substitute teacher wouldn't really know for sure, I guess, but you gotta take kids' words for it. Just because they're kids in a classroom doesn't mean they're gonna lie to you about everything. You gotta trust the kids. They're still people. Story 6. Not a teacher, but in 9th grade, my Algebra 1 teacher had her baby early in the year, so she was gone till the last month or 2 of the school year. The sub was a former teacher, so you would think that she's a great sub. Nope. She hyper-focused on 3 to 4 students out of the 28 in the class, and just taught them while completely ignoring the rest of us. She would pass out a worksheet, then go to her students and never acknowledge us again until she dismissed us. Never checked homework, never acknowledged us. If anyone outside of her favorite students raised their hand or spoke up, they were ignored, etc. Which went about as well as you would expect with a bunch of 14 to 15-year-olds. That class was just wild. The kids who actually stayed in the classroom anyway. It was a mess. I'm actually surprised we weren't reported or visited by the teachers on either side of us for how loud we were. After several months with this lady, the vice principal was walking around randomly checking classrooms and walked into our crap show Algebra 1 class. He lost it. Yelled at all of us to sit down and shut up, which she didn't acknowledge as well. He demanded she leave and sat with us the rest of the period. Never saw her again and had maybe 6 to 7 different subs after her. 2 weeks after this, our regular teacher came back. When she realized we had learned nothing and learned the extent of how useless this lady had been, she started tearing up. I passed the classroom on the way to the bathroom during the next period and saw her sobbing at her desk. A friend of my mom's worked at the central office where they assigned or organized the substitute teachers. That lady was permanently taken off of the list. Story 7. Not a teacher, but a student with a story nonetheless. Meet Mrs. Hostess, fake name obviously. Every time my 8th grade history teacher was out, Mrs. Hostess would usually sub for him. Not sure why, because she subbed other classes too. But all the incidents of note happened when she was subbed for history. 1. There happened to be a girl in the class who shared a name with an Irish folk song. Every time Mrs. Hostess took attendance, when she got to the folk song girl, she sang the whole song every time. 2. The history teacher kept candy and snacks in his desk. Lollipops that he would hand out for correct answers or just because. Some leftover Halloween candy and the Twinkie. The Twinkie, was not an ordinary Twinkie. The Twinkie was not an ordinary Twinkie. The Twinkie was an experiment in processed food. This Twinkie was still in its original individual packaging and looked normal at first glance, but was actually 3 years past expiration and rock solid. The history teacher demonstrated this by standing on the Twinkie during one of the first weeks of classes. All this to say this is a thoroughly inedible Twinkie. So Mrs. Hostess subbed again, and we knew she had discovered the lollipop stash because she was openly eating them during class. But it wasn't until the next day that our history teacher opened up his desk drawer to find that the Twinkie was gone. This woman ate an expired, solid Twinkie as well as literally all the food and candy in the teacher's desk. 3 years past expiration, you could stand on this Twinkie? This woman has buzzsaws for teeth. Story 8. A few of the periods I taught were co-teach classes, where a percentage of the students in the class have special needs but can work well enough in a general population classroom with assistance from a special education co-instructor. These classes were often very rewarding to teach. But one downside of teaching that population from a logistical standpoint is that I was often required to attend ARD meetings. Basically, every special education student has a meeting about twice a year, sometimes more frequently depending on need. In this meeting, administrators, teachers, counselors, parents and guardians, and the student themselves all get together to go over their status and review the various educational accommodations the student is receiving, to determine what they may or may not need to change to best suit their needs. I didn't have a problem with attending these meetings per se, but because they only take one period and several teachers are rotating through various meetings over the course of the day, the school had devoted ARD subs who were more akin to babysitters at best, as opposed to substitute educators. That means that during one period, hell can randomly break loose. One year I had a tough student who had some serious attitude problems, but was a good person underneath it all, and with whom I'd done a lot of work to improve her engagement and interest in my class. About halfway through the year, I got called in for an ARD meeting during the period I had said student. In my absence of 45 minutes, the sub decided to pick a petty argument with my kid, who was rightfully offended but unwisely overreacted and escalated things to making threats and nearly coming to blows with the sub, and she ended up with in-school suspension for a while. Getting the story from all parties and witnesses involved later, it's pretty clear the sub was to blame, and the kid who I'd worked so hard with was back at square one. I eventually got her back on track, and she ended up with one of the highest grades in my class at the end of the year. But I could only imagine how much better she could have been without the setback and the amount of trust in adults she had lost. Story 9. I'm a little late to the party, but here goes. I had a grade 1/2 class last year, and one student had diabetes. Let's call him Adam. So Adam had a cell phone that beeps when his blood sugar is too low or high. It's connected to the monitor. The cell phone has no other uses. No apps, no data, not even connected to the school Wi-Fi. The substitute saw his phone on his desk and promptly took it away as per the no devices rule. During gym class, an EA comes in to make sure everything is okay, and Adam is visibly ill. Pale, sweating, the whole works. Luckily, this EA knows Adam's medical plan. Instantly asks Adam for the phone, and he explains the sub took it away in the morning. The EA then loses it on the sub, demanding the phone. The sub calls in the principal to reprimand the EA, then gets reprimanded herself, as obviously she didn't read the student's safety plan. She was asked to leave, and the principal taught the class the rest of the day. Adam was fine, drank a couple of juice boxes, and had a granola bar. Mom picked him up shortly after. And this is why, as a teacher, you should ask questions sometimes. Not just be like, no devices, Adam. Sorry, buddy. Not even gonna ask why you have this blatantly on your desk or why it doesn't do anything. No questions, just no devices. Sucks to suck. And then the gall of this substitute to be like, oh, I'm gonna get this EA. I don't even know what that stands for actually, but I'm gonna get this EA in trouble too. Yeah, they should have lost something for this. I hope there were consequences. Poor Adam. Story 10. Had a sub who somehow allowed a last period class of freshmen to convince him that they were not supposed to be working on the packet that I left for the class, and which every other class that day had been working on, because they already finished it, and instead told him they were supposed to be watching a movie. He went to the library to get the movie, leaving the class unattended, which promptly broke out into a dance party involving dancing on the desks. My department chair's classroom was next door, but as she taught AP Government to seniors, she was able to leave them to come next door and figure out what the hell was going on. No sub. She calmed the class down and into the seats and into the worksheets and calls the principal, who met the sub on his way back from the library and told him he could go home. My chair also found it would be appropriate to basically call me and blame me for this while I was sick at home. I don't teach anymore. I mean, packets weren't a great emergency plan, but what can you do? They could have played Heads Up 7-Up for all I cared. They were a handful of a group on the best days. Freshmen after lunch during the last period of the day are a situation. Story 11. Not a teacher, but I vividly remember one incident of having a substitute in kindergarten. I had an infected cut on my toe and had been prescribed an antibiotic. That morning was the first time I took it. We were sitting on the floor for roll call, and I remember this burning pain in my abdomen. She told us to get up and go to our desks. I tried to, only to realize I couldn't move and just laid back. This sub was a total cow, and I remember she was always really mean. Anyway, she starts yelling at me for being attention-seeking and basically tries to pull me up. I'm in so much pain, I start screaming, and one of our teachers from the classroom next to ours comes over. They realize I'm not faking it and calls an ambulance. Long story short, I'm horribly allergic to penicillin and my kidneys were failing. I was in hospital for almost a week before I got discharged. Needless to say, that absolute jerk was not allowed back at the school, but I will never forget that day. We've seen some bad subs, but between the diabetic one and this one, those are the only two that would unalive a child. Accidentally, I guess, but still bad. Like, there are other things you should do to respond to these situations. Seems like a lot of teachers' go-to is just the child is acting up. And like, I'll grant you this, most of the time, that's true. But you gotta treat every case seriously because if you don't, things like this might happen, and that's not worth it. Obviously. Story 12. Not a teacher, but I participate in STEM programs a lot. In the 90s, I belonged to a club that refurbished old industrial PCs and donated them to schools. Sometimes we would get completely burned out motherboards or disk drives, so I took a bunch of those and made displays showing the insides of computers, and I would let the kids explore them as part of my session. Then I would dig out a couple of blown PCs and monitors, hand out the screwdrivers, and let them rip them apart. Yes, I was always careful around the old tube monitors. Once they were done, I would let them pick apart if they wanted to take it home. The younger kids especially loved this, and frequently I'd see some kids take home a hard drive controller or a graphics card like it was a real treasure. I even made the local news with my program. That's the thing about living in a small city. Eventually, everyone makes the news. So one day I went in to do my lesson at a high school, I think freshman or sophomore science class. The class had a sub and I had an appointment right after that session. So I told them I would come back to pick everything up the next day. The kids could take whatever they wanted from the old PCs, but please put my displays aside in the cupboard. Next day I came by and all my displays were still out and completely trashed. Worse yet, the sub's attitude was, well, kids will be kids. that was the last session I did ever for that program. This sucks to hear. This program probably inspired so many kids to go into a STEM field. Like, genuinely. And that's an incredible, amazing thing. And OP just had to scrap it all because of this one event from a sub not caring. That sucks, man. Story 13. Way before most of you were born. It's May, 1981. I have a bad cold. I'm moving from an apartment to our first house, and my wife is due to give birth to our first child at any time. It's a Thursday. I write lesson plans for Friday and Monday. Remember, these are days before cell phones or email. The plans are left on the front table of my classroom. Friday and Saturday are moving days. The new house is filled with boxes. We can't find anything. Sunday morning, my wife goes into labor, and by Sunday night, our beautiful baby is born. Since I'd left plans for Friday and Monday, I informed the office I would let them know Monday of my plans for Tuesday. I wasn't worried about my classes, but on Monday morning, the phone rang in my wife's recovery room. It was the principal telling me the sub had bailed because whoever had subbed on Friday had thrown out the lesson plans, not realizing they were to be continued on Monday. The Monday sub, probably rightly, refused to work without plans. I didn't know the sub on Friday wasn't going to stick around for Monday. Again, with no email option, I couldn't just send new ones. The principal demanded that I return to the school. The school was in a rural, small community about 25 miles from the city where we lived, and where the hospital was located. He wouldn't hear of me just telling him what the plans were to be. He demanded again that I drop everything and get down to school, which I did. Someone else later that day picked up my wife and son and drove them home to our house full of boxes, so I didn't get to have that experience. The principal called me into his office and lectured me. He said, "My wife had breast cancer surgery. You know what I did? I dropped her off at the hospital door and came to school because that is my job. I expect nothing less from you." Needless to say, we never really got along after that. I'm thankful that he retired a few years after that, and I went on to teach until 2008 and had a very good career. But it would have been much better if that substitute teacher had not thrown out my lesson plans that Friday afternoon. In my opinion, OP, you should be more upset with the principal, not the sub. The sub made a mistake, an oopsie. And that sucks, but it happens, right? The principal is the one who is absurdly unreasonable. My favorite part is the fact that he's like, "Oh yeah, my wife had breast cancer surgery, and you know what I did?" Sir, I don't care. That's great that you're not a great spouse, but I want to be. Story 14. Not a teacher, but I know this was a disaster for my teacher. We had been studying Romeo and Juliet and West Side Story, and our teacher had created a very comprehensive exam where we would be asked to compare and contrast characters, situations, and themes of the two as answers to some very specific questions. He had spent countless hours ensuring that it was fair and complete. We were going to have the exam the following Monday, and he was taking Friday off. So he told us that in addition to the weekend, we could also use Friday's class to prepare for the exam. His instructions to the sub were likely something like, "Tell them to prepare for the exam. They already know what to do." She marched in and shouted, "Prepare for an exam!" and proceeded to hand it out. Of course, we protested, but what substitute hasn't heard, "We're not supposed to get the exam today," from a class at one time or another? When Monday came, the teacher was devastated. He could not count the scores. He wouldn't even attempt to grade it. He didn't feel right giving the exam now that we had seen it. All the work he put into it and all the insight he suspected he might gain from scoring it were lost. Instead, we spent the day reviewing what we could have, should have, would have answered. As you can tell, I could really feel his pain. Well, that sucks. How did the sub know where the exams were, though, to give them out? Like, did the sub ask where they were and the teacher told them? Because that's weird. What happened here? I'm a little confused how this is even possible. Either way, though, this poor teacher, that must have hurt a lot. A lot of wasted effort, just on the teacher's part and the student's part. It just sucks all around. And do any of you have any substitute teacher stories? I'm sure there's not too many actual teachers in the comments, but most of you probably went to school, right? So if you have some, throw them in the comments. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you in the next one.